Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your host, Scott, and with me, as always, is my dynamite co-host, Caleb. Caleb, what's going on tonight? How are you?
The dynamite goes boom. What's that quote from the bad sports broadcast? Oh, you've never heard this?
No. Oh, I
Wow.
know what you're talking
It
about.
was that intro ruled then.
Yeah, that's
Boom goes the
exactly
dynamite. That's what he says.
that's exactly what I was referencing. The early 2000s YouTube clip.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's what our listeners will think of for sure. We'll say we're back again to talk about the experience growing up as youth group kids in the 90s and how that has shaped our adult lives. We'll talk to old friends about their faith journeys spanning from the 90s to today and discuss current cultural topics through the lens of someone who grew up during that era. Caleb, who are we talking to today?
Yeah, it's another one of my internet music friends. I mean, that's kind of what Jared is. So Jared joined us. He does a podcast of his own with a couple of folks, and I've been on that podcast, and he comments on music stuff, and that's where we got talking. Super cool dude. He's been on my music podcast, so Jared joined us.
Jared's pretty great. He and I and another guest that we'll have on soon became fast friends because I don't know, you introduced me to these people and then I start texting them. And then we don't stop texting because we find common interests and we all like the show Severance, which is rightfully so. It's the best show
Right.
ever. But like I was just texting them through the entire season because we just found this commonality and eventually we got to talk to him here today. So it's fun.
So were you texting with Jared before you had been on a podcast with him?
Yes.
That's hilarious. That's
Yes.
that's absolutely amazing. The funny thing is because you texted both of us before this episode that we recorded, and then he texted me today, and I didn't save his number, so I was like, "Who is this?" I had to like figure it out. I'm like, "I'm sorry, I don't have this saved yet. Who are you?" I've given my number out to a lot of people for podcast stuff, and he's like,
Oh yeah,
"Who
we've
is-"
texted and communicate on Instagram. We're very close,
"Oh, that's awesome."
very close. Not quite as close as you and I, but pretty close.
Sure. Well,
But
that's good.
anyway, Jared was a great guest. Had a lot to say. In fact, so much so that we're going to split this one in two parts because there's a pretty natural point of stopping there in the conversation and continue on next week. So you will hear the second half of our conversation with Jared next week. But Kale, what are some things you remember about our conversation with him?
Yeah, it's another unique story. It has some elements. This I say this every week. I feel like it has some elements that felt familiar and some elements that were new. This is another moment where he's in a kind of a smaller church, and then he's got this collective experience, and that's
Hmm.
really, really interesting to me. This idea that you've got this like I don't think we experienced that where we were like connected to other youth groups in the area from familiar churches. We just didn't have that experience at all. And so that's a really unique experience. We've heard about it a couple times, but that one always sticks out to me when you're like, oh yeah, we had our youth group, which was a small, really, it was almost like a Bible study, a
Hmm.
small group. And then we had this collective group that we got a whole bunch of people together. Super, super unique.
Probably the competitive nature in just myself. I don't think it was ever pushed from John or someone else at the top, but I always felt like our youth group in Woodbury was like a competition. We're like, A, we got to get the kids away from the Lutherans, and
Yeah.
B, we're way better than New Life. Like it was just like this competition, but no, here we are. Other people are collaborating and trying to share that experience among the groups together. Another thing that I remember from his conversation, something that's been brought up here or there, and I think we've discussed it a little bit, but he gives three different stories of being baptized. Grew
Yeah.
up Baptist, and he really is pretty eloquently talks about that feeling of I didn't quite do it well enough the first time because I feel like I haven't changed enough, or I feel like I'm not honoring God enough. Am I really saved?
Yeah.
I'll go do it another time, second time, even a third time just to be safe.
Yep.
I could identify with that. I did that too. Absolutely. Not get baptized, but certainly made that personal decision just in case the first one didn't stick.
Yeah, and you're right. It was a very eloquent and introspective look at it. Like it was great. It was a
Hmm.
very great explanation of it and kind of what was going through his mind. And my feeling is a lot of people are going to be able to relate to that and what he
Yeah,
describes.
for sure. For sure. Yeah, and then he gets into discussions about how things have changed. It certainly in how it relates to like how he views the idea of fear, which was a really cool part of the conversation too. I don't want to reveal
Yeah.
too much, but I really appreciated his take on fear of the Lord and kind of how that played out as a kid, but also now as an adult. So that was really, really cool part as well.
Yeah.
Jared, thank you for coming on. We are always looking for guests to interview and talk with. So if you're enjoying the show and you have a similar experience or a very different experience, all we're looking for is conversations about your journey. So please reach out to us. We'd love to talk with you and have you on as a guest. In order to do that, best way to get a schedule is just email us at isurvivedyouthgroup@gmail.com. That is our email address, isurvivedyouthgroup@gmail.com. So, anyway, thank you very much for listening, and we hope that you enjoy.
I want to break in and quickly remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s may not be held by or even approved of by everyone appearing on this episode. One of the goals of this show is to give everyone a safe space to share their opinions and thoughts on deeply personal matters of faith. We are not looking to start an argument, but instead we want to let people share how they feel. During our interviews and discussions, we may not represent every point of view on a given subject, and we understand that this may be frustrating at times, but it is the nature of a podcast discussion with a limited amount of time. We also know and want to acknowledge that our memories of events that happened 25 to 30 years ago may not be 100% accurate. We assume everyone's best intentions as they share how they remember the experience of their youth. Now, back to the show.
All right, we are joined tonight by our friend Jared. Jared, thank you for joining us. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Appreciate you jumping on with us.
Same. Thanks for asking me, guys. This is gonna be fun.
Yeah, yeah, you're very welcome. First of all, just kind of to get an idea, are you one of Caleb's music friends? And if so,
I think
how did you meet him?
I count as one of your music friends. Caleb, is that right?
You've been on the music show, so you definitely count as a music friend. Yes.
Good, good. That's I would say yes. I don't know. I came across your social media at some point. It's hard to pinpoint now, like the initial
Yeah,
point of connection, and then being active in the Pickle and Boot Shops discussion page on Facebook was probably where like there was more interaction there because we've done even like a Zoom with the whole group there a time or two, and then yeah, been on your music podcast, and you came on our podcast, and it kind of took off from the CCM Twitter thing, and then I think Five Iron Frenzy.
Yep.
Like I'm mixed up in those online circles as well.
yeah. Well, you will fit right in.
Yeah,
Excellent. Well, let's start from the beginning. That's where we always go because it helps lay the groundwork for your story. Tell us about, when did you attend youth group? Was it in the 90s? Was it earlier or later? And like, where was it? How was it? How was that all set up for you?
sure. It was the 90s for me. So high school graduation was 98. So all of high school in the 90s, all or in multiple locations. So my dad, by the time I was in youth group, middle school, my dad was had retired from the Air Force. So he went in straight out of high school, did his 20 and retired like in his late 30s. So kind of an early shift there, and then went into full-time ministry after
Oh,
retiring from the Air Force. In the Air Force, he worked in a hospital. He was a cardiopulmonary tech. And so he'd been really involved in like lay ministry while in the Air Force. But when he retired, that was the motivation. He was going to go pursue full-time ministry, and he went back to college and all of those things. So we moved initially to Florida, to the Panhandle of Florida, because my dad went back to a Bible college. He had gotten an associate's degree in the Air Force, but had not gotten a 4-year degree, and so wanted some theological training. And we ended up in the Panhandle of Florida in a little town called Chipley on I-10. It's north of Panama City, kind of in between Pensacola and Tallahassee, but
sure.
closer to Alabama than the beach. And
That's too bad.
it's yeah, it's not Disney World, Florida. It's not Miami, Florida. So imagine Southern Alabama, and
Mm.
whatever's in your mind is probably closer to where I lived than the resort world of Florida. So that's where we were. And that was right when I was starting sixth grade. I believe we moved down there. So it was like right at the start. And so initially it was we attended a First Baptist church there, kind of a standard early 90s youth group, I think. It was a small town of a few thousand people, but the biggest Baptist church in town. Well, I grew up Southern Baptist, and so a pretty good sized youth group with Sunday evening activities, Wednesday evening gathering, the whole youth praise band kind of thing, leading music,
Hmm.
games, always games, and then some sort of lesson from the youth leader, followed by go outside and play basketball on the hoop in the parking lot or
Sure.
flag football or whatever was happening kind of thing. That was early, but then my dad became a pastor of a little church in the area. And so that was a little bit of a shift. So we moved out of town to a little country church where we lived in the parsonage on a dirt road kind of situation.
Huh.
Wow.
So we're talking a church less than 100 members or attendees, probably in the 40 to 60, 70 range.
Mm.
And so youth group now meant like my brother, my sister, me, and maybe three other kids somewhere in like the middle school, high school range.
Hmm.
A big shift there. So not a lot of traditional youth group stuff in that church, other than we would go to a concert event, like in the area, things that came through that other youth groups would do, and we'd join up with other churches in the area for bigger things. But the week to week stuff dramatically changed
Wow.
there. And then in high school, ended up moving to Missouri. My dad went to seminary out
Hmm.
there. So then became pastor of another small church north of Kansas City. And that was another one of those small churches, handful of kids. But that place, like four or five churches in the association, so Baptist
Oh yeah.
organization was an association that were all similar size, so not enough youth to really do much of anything. Collectively hired a youth pastor. And so there would be a Sunday night youth thing that all of the kids from multiple churches would gather at one of the churches for kind of a combined thing. And then you'd have 20, 30 kids
Hmm.
as a group that way. So it
Mm.
was a lot different from going into sixth grade, kind of traditional, to by the time I graduated high school, was a lot of change.
Yeah, no doubt. That's going from kind of big to smaller and smaller.
Hmm.
Was there, and this is random, but do you have any recollection that that youth pastor that was collectively hired for all those congregations, like was he just doing his best with all the different influences and desires those churches had, or was he, was it a pretty smooth sailing job for him? Because I can imagine these days you get a youth pastor from five, six different churches, they're going to want different things out of that person.
Yeah, I, all my memories are that it was positive.
Hmm.
You know, he's still in touch with my parents. I haven't talked
Oh.
to him in a long, long time, but he was a great youth pastor,
Hmm.
well liked by all of us kids. And from what I remember, the expectation, people were just happy to have somebody who
Hmm.
could do things specifically for the youth. So there was an
Yeah.
actual program and there were other kids to interact with, and individually each church couldn't support it. So that collective thing led to something that we would not otherwise have. And then he was like one of those really, I don't know, maybe a stereotypical youth pastor. He's real upbeat, real positive, real high energy, kind of easy to hang out with, relatable for a teenager. He was a
Hmm.
seminary student as well, which I think being near seminary, Bible colleges in those situations, there's always an abundance of people in training looking for opportunity. And he was there at the seminary. He had been a youth minister previously, I think, but had gone
Hmm.
back to get an MDiv.
Sure.
So I think there was what I remember was all good, and that was 2 years, a little bit less, like junior, senior year of high school, really.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's good. He didn't get driven
Yeah,
from the position by people wanting different things and fighting
I
over him
don't
or
think
something.
so.
Yeah.
No.
Good. Good. Well, clearly, grew up in a Christian home with, a dad who, had a second career as a pastor, but that's pretty interesting too. For you yourself, during that change, those three different changes of churches, what did faith look like for you? What words or phrases would you use to describe your faith during that time?
Definitely evolving with new questions as new ideas were presented. So it was all inside of the Southern Baptist world. So that there
Right.
was some consistency there. It wasn't wildly different, but I think especially moving to Missouri and then kind of what we encountered there. And then my parents, I think what my dad was studying and how that was kind of bringing new knowledge to him and maybe changing some things combined with me getting a little bit older to know what was being talked about. I was introduced to like more kind of the Reformed theology.
Mm.
And so that was so I think just some things that were assumed or taken for granted, then there was a new doctrine or a new view brought into this, and it was like initially that's got to be wrong because it's different than what I knew before. And then my personality, I'm a little bit skeptical. I'm argumentative in a way that I don't like. I enjoy that back and forth. Like, let's get into a good debate about what we think. I don't get that does not make me angry, but I like an intense kind of
Mhm.
struggle with, okay, you say this, I don't think you're right. Let's get after it in this way.
Mm.
So that happened in our home a lot. Like my dad and my brother and I have an older brother. So we would debate. I remember strongly arguing like there's no way this concept of election can be fair, then God's a jerk kind of thing. But over time shifting towards agreement with that at that point. So I think there was a lot of engaging at that time, like high school for sure, with actually a little bit more in-depth theology than maybe childhood up through that point. Felt pretty confident every time I went to church on Sunday because I'd spent so much time in church from as long, from birth that I can remember, wherever I started with my memory, we were a Sunday morning Sunday school church, Sunday night training church, Wednesday night service, family. And then I was also homeschooled
Okay.
from starting in third grade. So church was also the social circle. That was the center of our social life, especially as kids. My mom was also a stay-at-home mom. So for our family, like the church was that social epicenter too. And so, having gone to church, basically, if there was an event being held, we were there. And then my parents were the stay and talk for a while. So we spent a lot of time in the church building kind of thing and felt pretty confident. Like I could answer all the Sunday school questions. I knew the Bible trivia. I was good at the Bible drills and things like that. And then getting a little bit older, I'd say like that youth group, probably past middle school, but then starting to engage with theology at a little bit more a deeper level. That was a big change at that period. Evolving is what I would say. And that was
Yeah.
probably a start of continual evolvement until today, really,
Sure.
but in a different way.
It sounds like your dad having been in that kind of similar situation of working through questions and maybe laying the groundwork of an environment for that type of conversation. Kind of had, it sounds like you had that at home a little bit and
Mhm.
things were open for discussion where, maybe that certainly wasn't part of my home life, which is, I think is kind of a cool thing having a teenager like we talked about, who is precocious and inquisitive, he doesn't mind having these conversations. So we've been trying to kind of keep it open. It sounds like you had that open environment for conversation at home.
Definitely that there wasn't a closed off nature of we just believe it, so you believe it, and like let's
Hmm.
not talk about it, I think, where some people may have experienced. And I would say though, we were it was a strict, rigid home in the sense of like kind of the 80s satanic panic into the moral majority stuff. Like we fit in line with that
Sure.
very strongly, I mean it was strict in that sense, but I don't like looking back now, especially with like time and space as an adult and now being a parent and thinking about how I'm doing a lot of things, it never felt oppressive in a sense where like there was a meanness to it
Mm.
or so it was strict, it was like a strong, if there was a TV show that had any profanity, it was off immediately. You know what I mean? Like there
Yeah.
was no alcohol in my house, our house. That's true to this day for my parents. Like some very strict rules in those ways. We didn't, especially through all those phases. I mean, as a homeschooler, we did a lot of different styles, curriculums, plans. We did a Bill Gothard year. My parents went to one of those institutes, and so we did the Bill Gothard curriculum. So I mean, there was some extreme kind of ideas that were definitely present in that way. But looking, I think what I saw from my parents was their commitment was deep, but there was an openness to learning, and my parents changed their mind over time. And I
Hmm.
think now, even though we're not in complete alignment today, like we would disagree on quite a few significant things now or do. My parents are not at the same place they were
Hmm.
at that same 30 something years ago. So I think that helped me is that my parents grew and changed their mind as things. And I look at it as they were working with the information they had. They were kind of following the influences that they were had as leadership in different ways. But then continued to work and think and do and kind of experience some things. So that was open in our house too. I never heard from my mom or dad like you can't say that or you can't ask that or
Hmm.
you do that. There was always a willingness to like have the conversation, even though they were pretty resolute
Hmm.
in where they stood. It wasn't a we don't know, so you decide whatever you want. It was just like it wasn't threatening, I don't think.
I think that's an important aspect of it too, is, especially as a kid, if you're shamed
Mhm.
about asking questions, you will stop, or you might still have them. You just won't go to your parents with them, that sort of thing. So to keep
Right.
it open and be like, hey, let's talk about this stuff, not just about faith, frankly, but about anything. It's pretty healthy dynamic, even though they're staying within the confines of their, you know, theology, Baptist theology, which is, to be expected.
Mhm.
Still a kind of a healthy place to be. I think it teaches a lot of people to think about things critically in a good way.
Yeah, I
So
think so.
good for them. So let's talk about the youth group experience itself. Like, what are some of your memories that pop up about youth group when you think of yourself during that time? Like activities, teachings, some moments that are still with you today.
For sure, the games being omnipresent. I think you couldn't gather as a youth without having a game. It had to be like a silly or a wacky game, right? Like it could never be straightforward. So there had to be a messy element with like food or shaving cream or some kind of implement or whatever to make it. I guess it had to be wacky, right? Like that was all.
Sure.
I don't know what the motivation was behind that, but it had to have a game to get our attention. And so, especially early on in that larger youth group, like that was the rhythm was so consistent. Gather, the hang out for a while. There's music playing, you chit chat, then it gets organized to a game
Mhm.
and then you break off into learning something, which probably the thing that like stands out, of course, was like purity pledges and true love waits, because that was more than the straightforward stuff of like how to be saved and you need to witness to kids or other people. It was this I that was the big thrust, of course, was like purity. So in our family, being homeschooled, we also did the whole courtship deal, so there was no dating even in our household. So it was pretty strict. We did not just have like Joshua Harris's book. I've seen him speak when he wrote the book and like did the homeschool circuit, like more than one times because we would go to these homeschool, a lot of times like book fair curriculum shows. That's where you go pick what you're going to do, but there'd be speakers involved. And so I think a lot of stuff we were more outside than in, even in what was being taught in the church. Like
Hmm.
I was, you know, I feel like it was a little bit of an outsider even in the church youth group because we were homeschooled and more conservative probably
Mhm.
than most in there and what we were allowed to do. I mean, we didn't have cable TV and those things like watching movies, listening to secular music didn't do that. It was all Christian music for sure that was allowable
Mhm.
in the household. So I remember it was not a lock-in, but a weekend disciple now in maybe seventh grade. And I don't really know the kids that well that I'm with, and you're staying overnight, which was like intimidating because they're all public school kids. I'm homeschooled, so we don't. My only interaction is Sunday and Wednesday night, like Sunday stuff, and then Wednesday night. So we're staying overnight, and Rump Shaker was out, and they were like the other guys were playing that, and I just like remember like distance. I'm gonna get in so much trouble if
Yeah.
someone. And then it was also like, what is this? Like they're allowed
Yeah.
to say that on the radio. So that is distinct to me. Is even inside of youth group, I didn't really feel 100% comfortable there.
Hmm.
I think because of being not just homeschooled, but the kind of homeschooled family we were. And then my dad was in Bible, which wasn't completely unusual in that area because there
Yeah.
was the school there, so there were others. I think ours was on the farther end. The friends that we hung out with outside of church were like the homeschool co-op group, and it was like we only had three kids, so we were on the low end. So as far as like our scale of like normal interactions, we didn't have 5 or 10 or 12, so like it was kind of like, I guess we'll let you in. Your mom makes bread, so we're close,
Nice. Yeah.
kind of thing. But.
Caleb, you've been nodding your head more during this conversation than most. I think
Well,
the homeschool stuff
we homeschool our
resonates.
kids, so yeah, it's definitely and it's funny because we've been called we were once called the weirdest homeschool family that a pastor had ever met because we just don't fit a lot of the stereotypes anymore. But yeah, all those things, a
Right.
lot of those things sound very familiar with the circles we run in still. And you mentioned like the curriculum fair, and I'm like, oh yeah,
Hmm.
those are huge now. Like, because
I
it's
bet.
it's a money making industry. Homeschool is at this point. So,
You don't say.
yep,
And I think, at least my perception is there's a little more openness to alternative forms of education now, like that include, it's not, when I was homeschooled, I feel like it was primarily for religious reasons. That's why you
Yeah,
homeschooled.
yeah,
There were not a lot of homeschooled people that it wasn't religiously motivated. And a lot of that motivation was like keeping you away from the dangers of the
yes,
secular world.
yep,
hmm
And I feel like there is more room for that's not the only reason people homeschool in 2025, especially post COVID, with like
yeah,
hmm
people see the value in some of the flexibility. Because I mean, that was cool as a kid. There were vacations were whenever
yeah,
yeah.
you took a day off when you needed to. If there was a family thing, we did it because school happened when we wanted it to happen. So like, there's a lot of benefits there that most people didn't know about.
yep. And we always joke that post COVID, the riffraff got let in because, like my kids used to be some of the better behaved kids, even amongst the standard homeschool. Just because
Hmm.
my kids are very well behaved. It has nothing to do with me, but they are very well behaved. And now they're like the golden children because there's a couple of co-ops that like I had to volunteer at, and I was like, why are none of these kids listening to this teacher? Like, what is going on here? And because it's just, the culture of it has changed. It's not just very conservative religious kids anymore. There's a lot more variety in the homeschool community at this point.
I can see
So
that.
we, Caleb, you and I released an episode probably a month or two ago now. It's where we talked about this very subject with my cousin DJ, who also homeschools his kids,
Yeah.
but for a variety of reasons similar to Caleb and his family. So I think you're right, Jared, is that a lot of people will do it now for various reasons. I think
Mhm.
religious reasons is certainly still the primary driving force,
Yeah.
or trying to protect your kids from what we would view as the world. But frankly, the we don't know. I don't know yet where your story is going to end up, and wherever it does, it's fine. But we've talked to quite a few people on this podcast who went through homeschool, and they're probably not in that place where their parents hoped or expected them to be. So, it's an interesting dynamic that still persists to this day. So, thanks for all that background
Yeah.
Yeah.
on that experience. You said you have kids. Are they youth group age? Do you talk to them about what you did during youth group times? Is that something that you all talk about?
So I do. We have two. Our oldest is 15, so she's
Perfect.
prime youth group. She's a freshman in high school, and then our youngest is 9. She'll be 10 in a couple weeks, so not quite there. She's a fourth grader. But yes, we've talked about it a little bit. I'll share stories. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about like how where I arrived at now. But I mean, we're still active members of our church
hmm
here, just kind of theologically in a different place than way back when, but still active, and that's been important to us that our kids are there. I feel like, from my perspective, it hasn't been a strong emphasis on what are you doing? Like, are you having a quiet time? Are you doing this? But somehow, our oldest, she reads the Bible religiously to make a pun there every day, and has for a few years now. And she started this initiative on her own. She's maintained it. No one, like, I don't check on her. It's not something that's ever been directed to her. She's got little sticky notes with little kind of cliche Christian sayings on them. And I was like, uh, part of me, I walked into a room and I was like, what happened? Like, you've never listened to K-Love. Like that part was kind of intentional. I mean, it's not my preference, but I also didn't want that to be your version.
Uh-huh.
But she's stumbled into some of that on her own, which is fine. And I feel good about it because I feel like, oh, this is all her ownership somehow.
Yeah.
It hasn't been my wife and I, other than we're there and her
Yeah.
faith is talked about at home and we're at church and we take her to the youth group and the activities and she participates. But each summer, it's like, do you want to go to youth camp? Do you want to go? Our church does a mission trip for the youth and a youth camp every summer. And we've asked her, do you want to? But you don't have to. Kind of, and she's chosen to do both in different summers and things
Mm.
like that. But it does come up because it's funny, she's just a little oblivious to that I'm like, you're fully formed in youth group culture and you have
It's
no
like,
idea. And she doesn't know that. And some of it's her friends from school have some more traditional, like their moms listen to K-Love, so
sure,
they've shared music with her and she likes it and that's fine.
sure. Good on them. I mean, you're kind of created a framework for her to discover it herself, no matter what that
Hmm.
looks like.
Yeah,
So,
that's the goal at least.
yeah, yeah. Well, overall, like, what, just for you yourself, what did you love about your youth group experience? I mean, having kind of three different youth groups, was there one overriding, factor that you really look back on and enjoy, or did each have their own unique flavor?
I think they're all a little bit different, but a consistency across the board was having a community. I mean, the social life just outside of faith was important by being homeschooled, and that was kind of the big thing that happened each week where we were out of the house and we were going to interact with other kids. I played basketball for a local Christian school, one of those that would let homeschoolers play. This was pre and like I feel like I'm old enough that nobody let homeschoolers play in public school back then. Now it's somewhat, I think it's
They have
available in
to.
most places.
They have
Yeah.
to. If you're in the
Mm.
district, they have to let you play. I mean,
Yes.
you could not make the team, but like
Right.
my son's on the robotics team for our local high school, and they were like, well, we've never had a homeschool kid, but yeah, come on in. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
we just had to sign a form, and he was signed up.
Yeah, so none of that was an option when I was that age. So, but there was a tiny little Christian school that honestly didn't have enough to field a basketball team, like a JV university. And so the homeschoolers in the area kind of made it enough. We weren't good, rode in the back of our coach's minivan and that sort of thing to other Christian schools across the Panhandle. But that was a thing to do. But other than that, it was youth group. It was the kids at church that were a social circle. So I think that was important. That Panhandle of Florida, where we lived was, I mean, we were a few miles outside of a blinking light town that didn't really have anything in it but two gas stations and a little diner. And we were not in that town. We were on a dirt road outside of that town. So it was, and we were we had one car as a family. So when my dad was in class or away, the car was, you weren't going anywhere. You were sitting there in the country and there was nothing but woods. So church on Sunday, church on Wednesday night was really important to just have something to do, even though it meant walking across a field because we lived
Sure.
in the parsonage. Um, yeah, it was a big deal there. I think my parents took their faith very seriously, not just by going to church on Sunday, but it was consistent throughout the week. And so having that place to go was important to me then, and I value that now
Mm.
of having support. And then that youth minister in Kansas City or north of Kansas City, having someone, especially at that point, I was a junior, senior in high school, a little bit older, having a youth minister who was interested and supportive and like easy to talk to and get along with was really important. It was, an adult figure. It wasn't my dad, but it was so this other person. And I think they're also connected. We still chat on Instagram now, but there was another guy there who was the only other kid I knew that liked Christian ska. And so he was a public school kid, but he was kind of the weird kid in his public school. And he was at one of the other churches, but on Sunday nights we got to hang out kind of
Hmm.
thing. And so me and this guy Brian became friends, and it was over Five Iron Frenzy. It was over the Supertones. It was because of the Dingies. It was because of Silage and things like that we bonded. So I think even in those youth groups, there weren't a lot of other kids that liked that. Everybody liked Audio Journal, the Newsboys or whatever, but not everyone else liked the ska and those things. So I found some kinship, like friendship that was meaningful by being kind of introverted, socially awkward, homeschooled, a little bit out there. Because even the church in Missouri, we were on a gravel road. We upgraded from dirt to gravel, but still not paved. Still living in the parsonage across the
Yeah.
street kind of thing. And then at that church, we did some youth camps, both one that we attended just traditional youth camp, and then a service kind of as camp for kids with different disabilities and illness where you went and served. So we
Mhm.
had the opportunity to do those things that were traditional youth group things too.
Well, Jared, I can relate. I also had a weird public school friend who was into Christian ska.
Yeah,
And
that guy, I remember that kid. He was
yeah,
messed up.
he was, dude, kid was super weird. I hope he's okay today.
He's not. He's not.
It's weird how that brings people together, but
It's the thing, I guess.
it's a little fascinating to me that no internet back in 1997, 98,
Mhm.
yet living on in a parsonage on a gravel road, and it might have met you in the Panhandle on the dirt road too, eventually. That stuff was spreading pretty wide, pretty fast through word of mouth and experience. So maybe we can talk
Yeah,
about that later too, in just terms of how we remember music and everything, because it's come up with previous guests as well. But like, I mean, I would assume like the nearest Christian bookstore to you guys was pretty far away. Like, how would we find out about that stuff were it not for the internet? I just don't remember.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah, and a little bit of like the youth leader would get the box of CDs or things
sure.
like that
Yeah.
Yeah.
where they would put them out there, and that was I guess the way to connect with the kids. You let us pick the music that everyone's listening to. You walk, so you'd have this box or this CD rack, and it was usually whatever the youth minister got in the mail
Yep.
for free, and that became the way to find stuff. And then yeah,
Hmm.
connecting point, and we can talk about it later, but I distinctly remember when how and where I heard the Supertones for the first time and Five Iron Frenzy for the first time. One was in Florida and one was in Missouri. At those two places,
Interesting. Interesting.
definitely not the internet.
No, definitely not the internet. It was the samplers, man. They had to spread the word through those samplers. They really
Those were
helped people
huge.
listen the big time. I love
They
those
were cheap
things.
too, affordable.
That's true. That's true. Well, let's kick things into kind of where we're at today and just shift the conversation towards that part of your journey. Like, yeah, how are things different compared to what they were at 30 years ago? You and I graduated high school about the exact same time. So, like, how would you describe them today compared to what it was back then?
I would say in an easy summary, I was much more confident then about what I knew about my faith and what I knew to be true about God, and I didn't have too many questions in the same way. There was a lot more certainty, and I guess felt understanding that now I would disagree with. So that would be the biggest shift is, and to me, I would separate that from the significance of faith in my life. It was just the way I experienced it was those things are also important of getting it right. I think I was attracted towards like apologetics mostly because of I wanted the logical defense. I wanted the clearly defined doctrine or interpretation that made it all work and made it all make sense that you could count on. That was very clear. I think to where I am now, I don't need that. I don't have it, but I also don't need it. For
Hmm.
me, not having that same level of confidence or certainty in getting everything right. I know for some people that's the breaking point where
Yep.
they like kind of leave their faith behind completely because it doesn't resolve in the ways they needed it to. For me, I think that's helped me maintain it and hold on is getting to a place to be okay with that because I couldn't solve every issue with I think no matter what kind of systematic theology or doctrine you come up, there's something in the Bible or something in the Christian tradition that raises questions that can't be easily answered. And that used to drive me crazy. I
Hmm.
had to know and I had to be right because it was so important to be right
Mhm.
on doctrine. I also think a big part of it is that's different now is not faith not being from a place of fear. I don't think I would have characterized it that way 30 years ago. That fear was a big driving force. But with time, space, and changing your mind, I see how big of an impact fear had that I didn't see that way. So I did I would say I got saved in the traditional sense, went forward to an altar call when I was 6 years old here in North Carolina. We lived at an Air Force base at the time.
Mhm.
And to this day can recall like I don't have a good way to describe it other than like I was stirred as a 6-year-old to do something, you know,
Hmm.
and I was a 6-year-old that did not like to talk to adults or strangers or anybody I didn't know or stand in front of other people. So I look back on that, I was like, something compelled me that I don't have a good answer for other than like I'll choose to believe that God is real and he worked in some way. So I had that traditional experience, but then was terrified twice as a teenager. I did it again and got baptized again
Hmm.
twice. And that first time I did it, or second time overall, I can pinpoint to Bailey Smith, the evangelist. He was popular in Southern Baptist circles back then. His
Okay.
son actually just resigned in some sort of disgrace at the church he was the pastor of in Arkansas. But he was famous for a sermon like called "The Tares Among the Wheat." And so it was very much in the vein of like a Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, like
God,
a
yeah.
very heavy-handed turn or burn, but it was centered around the scripture about being the tares will be taken out and burned that are hidden among the wheat.
Hmm.
And the driving thrust was this whole like you think you're a Christian, but you're not. And I was 10 maybe when I was like on a Sunday night revival service, like one of those terrified me because I was
Yeah.
so scared that I was a fraud and I didn't like I had to figure out if I was a fraud or not. And it was always this litmus test of like, well, turns out I really like looking at girls. I'm 14, like
Hmm.
I'm not supposed to, so clearly I'm not saved. It was literally that
Yeah.
kind of gripping of
Hmm.
now I'll look back and be like, that's just normal being a human being.
Yeah.
But I was so afraid and enough to like make two more public professions of faith, go through the experience of being baptized again, growing up in a tradition that believes persistence, right? You don't lose your salvation. But I was just, and even I remember we went to evangelism conferences as a family, where
Mm.
like a whole weekend where all you do is listen to people preach all day long with some special music, with some Southern gospel quartets and things thrown in. We were in a hotel. It was in Charlotte, I think, North Carolina here. We lived here at the time again. And like could not sleep and waking my dad up at like 4 o'clock. And like, I don't think I'm saved. I think I'm gonna go to hell. Like it was just
Hmm.
gripped me for years. And that last time I did it, I was 16 and it was a revival service, which you might appreciate this little anecdote. We lived outside of Wausau, Florida. So this was an association wide. We had all combined to have a 3-night revival service, all the churches in the association. But it was held in Wausau at the community space, which was called the Possum Palace
Okay.
because Wausau, Florida has a granite monument to the possum and they hold a possum festival every year. And the story that is that during I think the Great Depression, when food and money were scarce, the people who lived there trapped and caught and ate possums, and that's why they survived. And so the legacy is to celebrate the possum in Wausau, Florida. So like the second Saturday in August, I think still happening. There's a possum festival.
Whoa.
And in the city, the little town park, there's basically a slab of concrete that's covered that has basketball goals underneath it, and then a stage at one end. That's the Possum Palace. And we had a revivals a week at the Possum Palace. And it was another one of those. Some evangelist terrified me. I went forward again and got baptized again and still was terrified. And at that point, I was just like, I gave up. I was like, I'm either in
Mm.
or I'm out. I give up. Whatever happens. It was a
Yeah.
frustration thing, I didn't come to some sort of confidence or peace, or it was just like,
Hmm.
I'm exasperated with not sleeping and being
Mm.
terrified. So I'm just going to let it go and say it counted and hope it worked. It was
Third,
literally what
third time's the charm.
100%. And I was like, and people were like, I also went to the Bible college my dad attended initially before I
Mm.
transferred to a different university. And my brother graduated from that college. My sister graduated from that college. My brother-in-law graduated from that college. My brother became a pastor and a missionary and works
Mm.
with a multi-faith organization now. My sister's married to a youth pastor. So I'm the only one that didn't go into or marry into full-time ministry
Hmm.
out of college. So even at that point, I was just like, people would ask, you'd have to tell your testimony and like when you'd get saved. And I was like, I would just choose a different one. It kind of became a game. Like, okay, I'm gonna choose the one at 6, the one at 10, the
Right,
one at
right.
16.
See,
Like, however I want to tell the story this time. Like, I had to take an evangelism class where you had to have like your 30-second speech, your minute
sure,
long speech. And so I would just like change it up. I was like, I don't know, pick one of the
sure.
three. I'm not sure which one's which, but I hope one of them was good.
Hmm.
I have so many thoughts on this very serious topic of fear, but first I need to know if like Wausau High School, their mascot was a possum. Like halftime, a possum guy in a possum costume walks out and entertains the crowd.
Wausau is not big enough to have its own high
Oh,
school.
okay. Well, if
Oh,
it did, it would have adopted the possum as
A
its mascot.
100%. 100%.
Well, it's a interesting conversation to have around the aspect of fear. Obviously, there's verses in the Bible about fearing the
Hmm.
Lord, and I think you can make arguments that some aspects of that are like healthy, like you don't want to take it for
Hmm.
granted or whatever. But it was a tool to get people's attention.
Yes.
And I think we've talked about, I know Caleb, you said maybe on the podcast or to me privately, like you never remember having to, you know, make that decision more than once. And I know Tim talked about and a few others talked about it, like how many times did we make sure we were saved? Like a whole bunch. And if you're in the Baptist tradition, that includes the baptism part of it as
Hmm.
well. But also, too, why are you doing it a second or a third time if the theology is that once is enough? I think it goes back to the fact that what we learn doesn't always really deliver or change things as we expect them to, right? We get these big messages like,
Right.
once you become a Christian, your life is totally different and it's changed and the old is gone, the new has come, that sort of thing. But no, you're 14, you have hormones, you think girls are pretty. Like that stuff never like goes away. I've never met anybody say like, yeah, when I was 14 and I accepted Jesus, lust was gone. That's not how this works. And so because you
Not at
still
all.
struggle with it, and that's just one example, of course, but for boys it's a big one, and maybe girls too, but like for boys that's a big deal. There's so much guilt.
Hmm.
And if we're entirely if the theology is we're depending on the power of grace and God to change us and we can't change ourselves, why do we think that any sort of action is actually changing us for the better, in a more Christian way? It's a real struggle. And the reason I'm going down this road is my son, who I just dropped off at youth group an hour ago to have this conversation, has come into my office in the evening a couple of times and just been like, Dad, I don't think I'm a Christian. I'm not doing this well. And I've had to really encourage
Yeah.
him, like, look, it's not always about reading your Bible consistently. Some people like your daughter find that. It's not necessarily about like praying every day, but it's about how you are constantly interacting with God on a day-to-day basis and maybe how you're viewing other people through that lens and just trying to encourage them to take a little bit of a different route so it's not like a guilt-ridden thing every single day.
Hmm.
Because I really, really identify with that fear aspect of it. You always feel like you're never doing enough.
And I think a big challenge was I grew up in church from the very beginning. There, nothing was happening in my home. I was not rebellious.
Mm,
I was genuinely, I think, a an intentioned good kid in the sense that I wasn't actively trying. I was a kid, so I got in trouble. I did things I wasn't supposed to do, but there was no active rebellion. I've still never smoked a cigarette in my life. I didn't ever have a drop of alcohol till I was 23, I think, 22 or 23. We didn't have to worry about sex because I wasn't dating or no one was interested. The offer wasn't made, so it wasn't really an issue.
mhm,
So a lot of like, so when you're trying to, when you're afraid and you're like, I don't know if I'm a good enough Christian, there was no there was no dramatic conversion of behavioral shift because it was like I grew up kind of with this moral values. This is what I was
mhm,
taught as right and wrong. This is what I taught was the reasons for right and wrong. That was what I knew to be true from the time I could understand any of it. So there was never a paradigm shift and I think that was a lot of the fear was like there's this massive thing that's going to happen where you have a whole new perspective or you approach or you want different things. And I think that was the hardest thing for me. It was like I don't stop wanting the things I want, which are the things they tell me I'm not supposed to want, kind of
mhm.
thing. So you're always, I felt like I was always looking for like, where is the evidence that I did something bad and now I don't want to do it anymore? because I didn't have a lot of like obvious things to turn around around from that I could
Yeah.
like, there's the proof I stopped doing that thing over
Yeah.
there, you know?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you never had an old life that you turned away from. You're just kind of always battling what you would perceive as your old life in a different self.
Right.
You
My
know,
5-year-old
that,
life. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And you've turned your back on your 5-year-old ways. But
That's right.
no, I think that's a really interesting take because I think ideally none of us as parents want our kids to have that experience of like, oh, I was on drugs and I was
Right.
going down this road and all of a sudden, boom, Jesus came in and changed my life. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Obviously, it can, but most parents and most adult leaders want students and kids to have that experience of making the right choices. But even as you're making good choices, you're still feeling the weight of having desires that you shouldn't.
Hmm.
And, speaking from the same experience, like I can't, I mean, maybe God changed some of those, but like not entirely. There was never a chance for me to like step away from those similar desires. And like, that's something you struggle with your whole life. It's like, did God really change me if I still want these things I shouldn't?
And I think going back to like where am I today? A lot of what has changed is the things that I was afraid of or frustrated about or couldn't get beyond and that kept me awake at night thinking I wasn't a Christian, like of what I shouldn't. Now I'm looking at it and it goes like, no, that's just normal. The shouldn't list was wrong. You were given a bad shouldn't list. That was unreasonable. And I think some of that is the cultural stuff I grew up in. Like, I mean, you take like a Bill Gothard approach of like right and wrong. It's absurd. You know, like I would look at it now and be like, this is absurd.
Hmm.
But it was very serious business. And I think my parent, what I got from my parents that still matters to me now is they took their commitment to their faith very, very seriously, not in a way that's like quiet and there's no fun allowed. It was just like, no, this is important. And so we're going to take it very seriously because it's nothing matters more kind of thing. It's very
Yep.
significant. And that we follow this and do this right. And so some of those things we tried out were like bad influences. I think now I look back and I'm like, oh gosh, what were we thinking? And so yeah, and I think theologically grew up kind of an inerrantist infallibility approach to the Bible. It was very clear and plain, and it was an instruction book on how to live. And those are a lot of things where I no longer view the Bible or Scripture that way as having that purpose or functioning, and that saved my faith to this point. I think if I hadn't let go of those ideas, because I couldn't make it make all the sense I needed. And what I found was, so I went to a Bible college full of a lot of kids like me, a pretty conservative Bible college initially. So there were plenty of other homeschooled kids and weirdos, if you want to call them that, who agreed with me. So that wasn't difficult to kind of stay insulated and inside of what I was comfortable because that's how I grew up. It was when I branched out of that and I transferred from that college to where I work now, which is a conservative Christian college, but it was like I remember being warned about like it's liberal up there, like which was also a Southern Baptist conservative college where like there was men's campus and women's campus. Like my now wife, we started dating in college here, and if I was sitting outside on a bench by her dorm at 9 o'clock at night, campus security would come by and like ask me to head back to men's campus. So it was not a liberal
I was gonna
campus.
say that's the most liberal thing I've ever heard on a college campus.
Exactly. It's
Yikes.
outrageous,
Yeah.
really. But I was warned from my previous, like that little Bible college about it's liberal up here. Mostly because like they did have visitation once a month where for 2 hours you could go into opposite sex dorms if you signed in on a list and left your door propped open. Like that was the tinge of liberalism that we had to be worried about and concerned about.
Hmm.
So I came here and then it was just there were actually kids here who weren't committed to full-time ministry because the other school was a Bible
Yeah.
college that was you had to sign up like write a statement about faith and
Yep.
calling and ministry, not just some sort of belief, but also how are you called to ministry.
Hmm.
And so that was a shift. And then I graduated, and my wife and I both went to the University of Florida for grad school, which is a way different environment, obviously. One of the largest public schools in the country in an SEC party town. And then all of a sudden my friends were no longer people I knew from church or were not Christian at all because they were my classmates and like in my grad program. And that's who I now hung out socially with. And I started doing tailgate Saturdays and like all these things. And I think what happened to me as I grew up, like you didn't drink because drinking made you bad. People who did it were bad. Like I don't remember hearing that out loud, but it was just kind of what you absorbed.
Yeah.
People who do those things are bad people.
Yep.
So it's not just that the activity is something you shouldn't do, but the people are bad. You should stay away from them. And then I was like, I got to Gainesville, got to grad school. Especially I stayed a couple years after I graduated, worked on campus,
Mm.
and my now wife went on to her first job was in Tennessee. So we'd been dating years at that point and knew we were going to get married, but it didn't, we had first career opportunities kind of thing. So we stayed separate. So I was in a committed relationship, but in Gainesville, and all my friends were single guys. So we went out on the weekends. And I wasn't looking to meet weekend or women, so I was just drinking a lot of beer, basically, is what I was doing. And then in those years, I was like, oh, everyone said these people are bad, but Saturday nights at Dirty Nelly's singing Irish drinking songs with like pints of Guinness is actually fun, and these people are nice. Like, and they're not even mean. They don't
Hmm.
seem as evil. Which sounds funny to say, but that was like an eye-opening. People who go to the bar on Saturday could also be kind on Thursday,
Sure.
Hmm.
which kind of disrupted my paradigm, even though I'm 20 something years old at this point. Going into that, I just stayed away from all that. Even at like in college, those who did, I just didn't. I found myself in a couple of parties, and it was like people would offer a drink. I was like, no, and I was never comfortable. I didn't really like being there.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
spent a few years in Gainesville. Those were my friends. That was my support group. Those are the people. Those are the people who were, around. That's what I did Thanksgiving with when I couldn't go home. Like all of the like normal stuff, and that began a shift of like, okay, I was warned falsely about this, and that also was a period of I kept going to church there, but that was the first time I'd ever experienced a hangover in church, and that became a not uncommon thing for 2 years
Hmm.
because game day Saturday was game day Saturday, but
All day.
there was a level of guilt where I'd wake up on Sunday and be like, "Oh, but I better go. I can't be out Saturday night if it causes me to skip Sunday." So I went out. I'm gonna be there, but sitting in church with a headache, like which
Hmm.
was a brand new thing. But I think recognizing that whatever I thought was true about the world out there was not entirely true, especially kind of getting thrown in the mix in a large party school really shifted a lot of like, okay, this isn't true.
Hmm.
It turns out the drinking thing's not as bad as they said it was. Like it doesn't automatically ruin lives. I don't have a DUI yet. Like all the thing is the slippery slope. I haven't fallen off.
Yeah. Right.
All the terrible things that were supposed to happen didn't, but I have made some really good friends. I've had some really enjoyable, like times,
Hmm.
in ways that didn't feel unlike church as far as like a community
Hmm.
that was supportive. And so that I think unraveled just like, well, so what else doesn't check out? I didn't lose like confidence in God or the
Hmm.
existence of or anything like that, but it was just like, huh, I don't think this all lines up with what I've been very adamant about being was true.
Hmm.
And now it seems like my truth isn't holding up very well. And so what is the what is truth, which led, I think, to an openness to different in because I think part of that conservative upbringing was even different theological viewpoints were a threat. So you didn't let those into your world either,
Yeah.
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah. Once the outside world is experienced in one way, shape, or form, like it's gonna happen.
Hmm.
How do we prepare our kids for that? And then as they become young adults, they're going to be making their own decisions. And I don't think it's so much the activities themselves, like you said, it's finding out that alcohol is like not the worst thing in the world. It's more of you realize that people are normal people. They're not antagonistic against you unless maybe you're being a jerk, and they're
Right.
not trying to like ruin your life. They just want to be your friend. And sometimes you get close to people who don't have the same belief system as you. And you start to realize like the world is way, not even bigger, way bigger than I ever thought it could be. And that can really change people's perspectives. And I think going back to maybe our homeschool conversation too, what I see, not in like Caleb or my cousin or anything, but what I do see in some of the circles that we run in now, because I'm similar to you, Jared, like I've gone on through a path of wrestling with inerrancy and kind of coming out the other side of not really adhering to most of it. A lot of the theological beliefs I had 25, 30 years ago are definitely changed, if not opposite. But we still go to church because we think it's important. I literally just drop my
Hmm.
kid off at youth group and I have to leave in
Hmm.
33 minutes to go pick him up. You know, it's still important to us. And so when you said that, made that comment, like separating yourself from inerrancy almost saved your faith, that's a really interesting and I think perceptive comment in my opinion, because it that happens for a lot of people is they have to kind of step away from some of those teachings that cause them to be so confident and comfortable in
Hmm.
their faith because it wasn't challenged by anything. I identify with your story quite a bit.
Thanks for listening to this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. We hope you enjoyed it. Once again, we do want to say thank you to Jared for taking the time to talk with us. It was great to hear about his experience and just about his journey. And we got something new, another new thing that we hadn't heard of before. So that was pretty exciting. Let us know what you thought about this show or any of our other shows. You can find us on Twitter at the handles at SurvivedYG. We're not super active there, but you can definitely find us there. If you want to find our personal Twitter accounts, that's the way to do it too. The easiest way to get hold of the show, and you might want to get a hold of the show because you want to join us. We want to hear your story. So if you want to join us, you can always send us an email at isurvivedyouthgroup@gmail.com. Again, that is isurvivedyouthgroup@gmail.com. We'd love to connect. We'd love to hear your story. Please subscribe and share the podcast. If you're so inclined, leave a rating or a review. If you enjoy the show, you might also enjoy the other podcast I do. It's a music podcast called the Album Anniversary Podcast. Over the last couple of years, I've researched and documented the release date of thousands of albums. Throughout the week, I post about them on social media. I have had a couple different formats on the show, but it's just a chance to sit down with somebody and talk about a music or talk about an album that they love. And once again, that's called the Album Anniversary Podcast. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Positive Charge by the artist Dread Pirate Roberts. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.